the Saxons started their invasions, their tribal culture was less Romanized than that of any other Germans. The territories that attracted the wild pagan Saxons were in Britain, a province so remote from Rome that the empire abandoned it early in the 5th century. The island was not only insulated by distance and the English Channel, its Latin culture was so superficial that after the Romans departed, the native Britons reverted to their Celtic languages and their own tribal ways. The Saxon invaders, along with their close kinsmen, the Angles and the Jutes, could develop their society with a minimum of both internal cultural resistance and external military interference. Of the actual Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain, few historical facts are known, but the meager literature on hand, scattered contemporary references, latter-day traditions, and half-legendary accounts permits a reasonable reconstruction. It appears that the early Saxon raids were followed by several invasions around 450, and that warfare continued intermittently for more than a century. The Britons put up a stubborn fight, but were gradually forced to give ground. The main body of Britons made a valiant last-ditch stand in southwestern England. Here they were given a final respite by the victory of their tough war leader, a certain Arthur, whose fame was embroidered 6 centuries later in the anachronistic tales of King Arthur and his Round Table of Knights.
There is some evidence for the existence of a British leader in the late 5th, early 6th century. But that leader is not in contemporary sources named. It's not until 300 years later we have the name Arthur attached to the leader of that period of resistance when the British are fighting back against the Saxon invaders. And it's certainly not until Geoffrey of Monmouth that we get anything like a constructed narrative of King Arthur's life, his battles, his knights, the fellowship that he creates, and so on. The modern conception of Arthur as the leader of a band of knights and so on, a chivalric romance.
To try to understand what kind of man Arthur was from an historical point of view, perhaps we should consider him as a Roman hero or a Romanesque hero. Does he reign in the period after Britain's severance from the Roman Empire? Is this where we would place him historically?
That's certainly traditionally where scholars have put him. That the Romans pulled out, of course, comparatively early from Britain. Britain was not an important province for the Romans. It was not a wealthy province that they were going to risk the home front to defend. So they pulled the legions out. There seems to have been a period when Britain went on by its own devices, using the Roman system of administration, and it seems to have been comparatively stable, and even without the Roman legions there. And then, of course, you get the Saxons, the Jutes, the Angles, coming across the North Sea. And there was obviously a resistance from the Celts, the British who lived there, with presumably some stiffening from the old Roman families who'd stayed on. But there wasn't any kind of formal Roman administration still in place, I think.
What did the people on the island look like? Who are they composed of, from a cultural point of view?
They're the ancestors of the modern Welsh and Cornish. The standard account is that as the Angles and Saxons and Jutes arrived, they first arrived in Kent, in the southeast corner of England, that they gradually drove the original inhabitants, who were Welsh-speaking, Celtic-speaking, westward and northward, and that they were finally driven into these havens in modern Wales and modern Cornwall. The Cornish people no longer speak a Celtic language, though Cornish was spoken until the 19th century, but the Welsh, of course, still. Welsh is still quite a viable language. So those are the people who would, I think, have inhabited the whole of England at one time. The Gauls also were Celtic, another Celtic tribe, but by the time the Merovingians, the Franks arrive, the Gaulish people are, by and large, speaking a form of Latin. It's the origin of modern French, of course. So the influence there was considerable enough to affect the language, which doesn't seem to have happened in England. The Welsh were not speaking a kind of Latin at the time that the Saxons and the Jutes arrived. I think the real problem for the Romans was that England was the British Isles was just not wealthy enough. There were certain tin mines, for instance, which were useful to the Romans, but there was a lot better arable land in Gaul. There was wealth to be had elsewhere in the empire, I think.
The later empire, this period in the 400s, it cherished the dream of a world restorer. I guess they weren't too satisfied with the emperors that were running the show. I guess they had a choice of a ruler in the east and a ruler in the west.
Yeah.
So they had this dream of the restitutor orbis, who would turn back the destructive forces and renovate Roman civilization. Is this going on on the island at the time?
There aren't the chronicles. In France, you've got Gregory of Tours writing, and certainly when you get to the Eastern Roman Empire, we've got a strong chronicle literary tradition. But there's just not the evidence from England to know how people regarded their leaders and how people regarded the political situation. It could have been just a small sideshow in the grand picture of the breakup of the empire.
Let's just take a sidetrack here. It would be the churchmen who would really be the literate ones in the country.
Yeah.
And it would be their responsibility to be recording history for that particular culture.
Sure.
For some reason, they just didn't do it.
Well, I think it was times were bad. I think when you're protecting your home and family and so on against barbaric invaders, you don't have time to sort of set up elaborate scriptoria. I mean, writing was a comparatively cumbersome process in those days. You wrote on the skins of sheep, which needed to be stretched and dried and scraped, and you had to make your own ink and get quill pens and so on. This is not the kind of thing you do when the barbarians are at the door, I think. The one chronicler we have from this period, or the one historian that we have from this period, a man called Gildas, was writing in Wales, which presumably was comparatively safe. I mean, the mountainous area of Wales was comparatively safe. But later on, of course, you get a very strong tradition in Ireland. The Anglo-Saxon Jutes never got to Ireland. They never crossed the Irish Sea. And arguably in the 6th, 7th, 8th century, Ireland was the most literate and cultivated part of Europe. It was the one part that the Germanic invaders never got to. And things like the Lindisfarne Gospels and so on, those beautiful illuminated manuscripts come from Ireland at this period.
Thanks to men like Patrick, who were probably from the same time as Arthur.
Right, yeah. In fact, the Christianization of England occurs in a sort of pincer movement. There are Irish monks who arrive in the north and work their way south. At the same time, there are Roman missionaries from the south. They have different ways of calculating Easter, and this leads to a problem when the two groups meet. But
and then the Britons do attain their independence with the full support of Rome. Who will save the island from the Saxons? Who is capable? Who has the means within their disposal to do it?
Well, presumably some descendant of the Roman patrician tradition, an old Roman family or a Romanized family of patricians. One would assume that this is where the leaders would come from. The Ambrosius Aurelianus, who is mentioned by Bede. Arthur, if he existed, and Arthur is a Roman name. It's not a common Roman name, but it is a Roman. It's not a Celtic name. I mean,
what did the Romans leave in place to assure some line of succession?
I don't think we can really know. They left behind, of course, an infrastructure of civilization. I mean, there were Roman roads, some of which can still be seen today in England. Stone buildings, fortresses, a system of communication, presumably a system of trade network, and so on. But as far as a system of government, I think that's how well that would have stood up. I don't think we can really know. Since the Roman province wasn't under threat at the same time that Gaul was, or Italy and Spain and so on, it's quite possible that a system of Roman administration would have just continued running independently of Rome for a while. Though presumably it wasn't collecting taxes and sending it back to Rome, sending money back to Rome as it had in the heyday of the empire.
We can only wonder if Rome still expected to
Yes,
get
that's right. I think they did for a while, actually. Yes, I think they did. There's some evidence that they did. But